All right, hello and welcome to this episode where we're going to talk about checking OCD. So my name's Matt and I'm the founder of Restored Minds, and I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. And in this episode, I want to talk about this idea of checking OCD. It's actually a request that we got from one of our viewers. So thank you so much for that. And any of you that ever have requests, please put them in the comments below. As we always like to, take requests and ideas for episodes, as well as we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing and sharing on your social platforms, just because we want to try to get this out to as many people as possible. So when it comes to checking OCD, the question about checking OCD, I kind of want to start there, right? Because if we call it checking OCD, then we're assuming that checking is the form of OCD, and that's actually kind of a backwards question. Let me go ahead and explain what I mean. So when we talk about most forms of OCD, what we're usually categorizing them as is the thoughts that the person is experiencing, right? So, for instance, if someone has fears of getting a disease and they do a lot of washing rituals, right? We don't usually call it like washing OCD. We call it contamination OCD because their fear is related to contamination. And same thing if someone has intrusive thoughts about, harming someone, we call it usually harm OCD, right? And the rituals they do are directly related to the intrusive thoughts that they have, right? The reason we don't categorize the ritual as the type of OCD is because rituals can take on any form, right? And the rituals are actually the symptom, right, that we notice, right? So when if you have a loved one or you notice yourself checking things all the time, right? Checking is actually it's the result of something, right? It's the behavior you're doing to neutralize a feared idea or thought, right? So with checking OCD, checking is a very common compulsion, right? It's one of the big main categories, but there's so many ways that checking can manifest, right, in a person's life. So if someone is worried, for instance, like the thought, right, the obsession of what if I left the stove on and my house burns down? And that causes anxiety, well, they might go back home to check the stove, right? And you might see the person check the stove again and again and again, right? Someone might check the locks in the house. Well, the reason they're checking the locks is usually because, well, what if something bad happens? What if someone breaks in, right? That thought starts, then the anxiety hits, and then the checking is the behavior, right? So I just want to kind of clarify that for a second, because it's important that we understand kind of why we're calling it checking OCD, right? Because it's a very common phrase, and people use this phrase a lot. But checking is usually just a thing that a lot of people notice the person doing, right? Like, why do you keep checking that, Or even you notice yourself doing, like, why do I keep checking? But a lot of times, checking will also be internal, right? And a lot of people don't realize this about, like, the compulsion of checking, right? People will do things like check to see if they're having thoughts in their head that they don't like, right? So when they wake up, it's kind of like a quick little mental scan, like, am I having those thoughts, right? Or even check to see if they're feeling anxious, right? Like, do like kind of physical check-ins, like, is the anxiety there? And they kind of draw their conscious attention into parts of their body where they know the anxiety's been before. So it might be in the chest, it might be kind of in their shoulders, or, just kind of their overall feeling state, right? That's an example of checking. There's also, people who have worry that they might impulsively snap and do something, right? They might check to see if they do anything, like if they have the urge to do something. So for instance, I remember one time I had a client who was worried that they couldn't walk near like rails, right, at the mall, right, that were, 1 or 2 stories up, I'm sorry. So because they were worried, like, what if I impulsively just jump off, right? So the person would kind of, as a compulsion, right, because the fear, again, the obsession is, what if I jump off? That produces the anxiety. The checking is to see, like, they might stand near the rail and kind of see, like, am I going to jump off, right? And try to, like, check to see if they feel this urge to jump, right? And this happens also with all sorts of intrusive thoughts as well, right? So all the intrusive thoughts of, like, what if I snap and harm someone, right? Well, what might happen is someone might be cutting an onion with a knife, and like start to check to see, like, is my hand, am I in control? Like, you know, like checking to see how the knife feels in their hand. Or someone with sexual intrusive thoughts, right, might, you know, look at a person and then scan to see if they feel aroused, right? That's them internally checking. So when we talk about checking OCD, the reason I wanted to make this episode is because I just kind of wanted to, you know, help better, what's the word, I guess, better like open up the conversation as to what checking is, right? Checking is the behavior, right? It's actually not the form of OCD. In fact, I would argue almost every form of OCD usually does some kind of checking, right? And so when we understand that checking is the behavior, then we can kind of circle back up the loop and say, well, why are you checking, right? And that gives us a better idea to what the catalyst for the behavior is. And that helps us better understand how to address that thought and how to respond to that thought correctly without doing the behavior of checking, okay? So because again, it's so important to understand that checking is just a symptom that we're seeing, right? But there's almost in every case that I've seen, there's always the thought or the fear or the obsession, right, that starts, and then that anxiety kicks up, or that feeling, that uncertainty kicks up, and that's what drives the checking behavior. But it's so important to remember that checking can be external, right, things like locks and the stove and keys and all this other stuff, but it can also be internal. And if you're checking internally or externally, that is what's fueling the cycle and keeping that loop going. So it's so important to understand why the checking behavior is being done in the first place. And that's when we can start to respond to the thoughts correctly and ultimately the anxiety correctly, forego the checking, and that's what's going to allow us to break out. So hopefully that's helpful in understanding kind of what checking OCD is. It's a great question, and I just wanted to kind of help break it down a little bit to help you understand what that is and how we would start to work with someone who checks a lot. So thank you so much for tuning in. And again, please help us out by subscribing and liking and commenting. We also have additional resources down in the notes that you can get over at restoredminds.com, the downloads and webinars, as well as live Zoom calls with us and Q&As and whatnot. So thank you again for hanging out. Hope you guys have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Take care. Hey there, Matt here, and thank you for watching that video. And if you're struggling with stress and anxiety, I just want to let you know that I have a free 7-minute meditation that I'd like to give to you. You can just click the link right down in the notes to get instant access, and we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing to our channel. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you soon.